Pensive, the priest lowered his head and touched the end of a thumb to his lips. Then he dropped it and looked up at Chris. "Listen, maybe this will help you to understand," he said slowly and gently. "The church, not me, the church, once published a warning to would-be exorcists. I read it last night. What it said was that most of the people who think they're possessed or are thought to be possessed, and now I'm quoting word for word, are far more in need of a doctor than of a priest." Now can you guess when that warning was issued? No, when? The year 1583. Chris stared in surprise at first, and then, lowering her gaze, she murmured, "Yeah, that sure was one hell of a year." She heard the priest getting up from his chair. "Let me wait and check the records from the clinic," he told her, "and in the meantime I'll be taking Regan's letter to her father tape plus the tape I just made to the Georgetown University Institute of Languages and Linguistics. It could be this gibberish is some kind of a language. I doubt it. But it's possible. In the meantime, there's a lot that could be riding on comparing Regan's pattern of speech in her normal state with what I just recorded. If they're the same, you'll know for sure that she isn't possessed." "And what then?" Chris asked him. The priest probed her eyes. They were swirling with turbulence. "My God," Karas thought. "She's worried that her daughter isn't possessed." His nagging sense of some even deeper problem, something hidden, had returned. "Could I borrow your car for a while?" he asked. Chris looked bleakly aside. "You could borrow my life for a while. Just get it back by Thursday. You never know, I might need it." With an ache, Karas stared at the bowed and defenseless head. He yearned to be able to take Chris's hand and assure her that all would be well. But he couldn't. He didn't believe it. Chris stood up. "I'll go get you the keys." She drifted away like a hopeless prayer. Karas walked back to his room at the residence hall where he left Chris's tape recorder, collected the tape of Regan's voice, then went back across the street to Chris's parked car. As he was settling into the driver's seat, he heard Carl Engstrom calling out from the doorway of Chris's house, "Father Karas." Karas looked. Carl was rushing down the stoop. He was pulling on a black leather jacket and waving. "Father Karas. Just a moment, please," he called as he trotted up to Chris's car. Karas leaned over and cranked down the window on the passenger side, where Carl stooped down to look in at Karas and ask, "You are going which way, Father Karas?" "DuPont Circle." "Ah, yes, good. You could drop me, please, Father. You would mind?" "Glad to do it, Carl. Get in." "I appreciate it, Father." Carl got into the car and closed the door. Karas started up the engine. "Mrs. McNeil is quite right, Carl," he said. "Do you good to get out?" "Yes, I think so. I go to see a film, Father." "Perfect." Karas put the car in gear and pulled away. For a time they drove in silence, Karas preoccupied, searching for answers. Possession? Impossible. The holy water. But still. "Carl, you knew Mr. Dennings pretty well?" Sitting stiffly erect and staring stoically straight ahead through the windshield, Carl said, "Yes. Yes, I know him. When Regan, I mean, when she appears to be Dennings, do you get the impression that she actually is?" A waited silence. And then a flat and expressionless, "I do." Karas nodded and murmured, "I see." After that, there was no more conversation until they reached DuPont Circle, where they came to a traffic signal and stopped. Carl opened his door. "I get off here, Father Karas." "Really? Here?" "Yes, from here I take bus." He climbed out of the car and with a hand gripping the edge of the open door, he leaned down and said, "Thank you, Father Karas. Very much. Are you sure I can't take you all the way? I've got time." No, Father. This is good. Very good." "Well, okay. Enjoy the movie." "I will, Father. Thank you." Carl closed the car door and stepped onto a safety island, where he waited for a traffic light to go green, and as Karas pulled away he stood stoically watching the bright red Jaguar coupe until at last it disappeared around the bend onto Massachusetts Avenue. Carl looked at the traffic light. It had changed and he ran for a bus that was now pulling into a bus stop. He boarded, took a transfer, changed buses and then finally debarked at a northeast tenement section of the city, where he walked 3 blocks and then entered a crumbling apartment building. At the bottom of a gloomy staircase, he paused, smelling acrid aromas from efficiency kitchens, heard from somewhere upstairs the soft crying of a baby as a roach scuttled quickly from out of a baseboard in erratic, zigzagging darts, and in that moment, The sturdy, stoic houseman's entire being seemed to crumple and to sag. But then, gathering himself, he moved forward to a staircase, put a hand on the banister and started slowly climbing the creaking and groaning old wooden stairs. To his ears each footfall had the sound of a rebuke. On the second floor, Carl walked to a door in a murky wing, and for a moment he stood there, a hand on the door frame. He glanced at the wall. Peeling paint, graffiti. Petey and Charlotte in a penciled scrawl, and, below it, a date and a drawing of a heart that was bisected by a thin, jagged line of cracking plaster. Carl pushed the buzzer and waited, head down. From within the apartment, a squeaking of bed springs. Low muttering. Then someone approaching with a sound that was irregular, the dragging clump of an orthopedic shoe, and abruptly the door jerked partly open, the chain of a safety latch rattling to its limit as a woman in a stained pink paisley slip scowled out through the aperture, a cigarette dangling from the corner of her mouth. "Oh, it's you," she said throatily. She unloosed the chain. Carl met the eyes that were shifting hardness, that were haggard wells of pain and blame. Glimpsed briefly the dissolute bending of the lips and the ravaged face of a youth and a beauty buried alive in 1,000 motel rooms, in 1,000 awakenings from restless sleep with a stifled cry at remembered grace. "Come on, tell him to fuck off." A coarse male voice from within the apartment. Slurred. The boyfriend. The girl turned her head. "Shut up, arsehole, it's Pop," she scolded, and then turned back to Carl. "Listen, he's drunk, Pop. Ya better not come in." Carl nodded. The girl's hollow eyes shifted down to his hand as it reached to a back trouser pocket for a wallet. "How's Mama?" she asked him, dragging on her cigarette, her eyes fixed now on the hands dipping into the wallet, the hands counting out $10 bills. "She is fine." Carl nodded tersely. "Your mother is fine." As he handed her the money, the girl began coughing rackingly. She threw up a hand to her mouth. "Fucking cigarettes," she chokingly complained. "I've got to quit, goddammit." Carl stared at the puncture scabs on her arm, felt the $10 bills being slipped from his fingers. "Thanks, Pop." "Jesus, hurry it up," growled the boyfriend from within. "Listen, Pop, we better cut this kinda short. Okay? Ya know how he gets sometimes." Elvira. Carl had suddenly reached through the opening in the door and grasped her wrist. "There is clinic in New York now," he whispered to her pleadingly as she grimaced and struggled to break free from Carl's grip. "Pop, let go. I will send you. They will help you. You don't go to jail." "It is." "Jesus, come on, Pop," Elvira screeched as she wrenched herself free. "No, no, please." His daughter slammed shut the door. Standing silent and motionless in the dank, graffitied tomb of his hopes, the Swiss manservant stared without sight for long moments until at last he slowly lowered his head in grief. From within the apartment he could hear a muffled conversation that ended with a cynical, ringing woman's laugh. It was followed by a spate of coughing. Carl turned away and felt a sudden stab of shock. "Perhaps we could talk now," said Kinderman breathily, hands in the pockets of his coat, his eyes sad. "Yes, I think that perhaps we could now have a talk." Chapter 2. Kara's threaded tape to an empty reel on a table in the office of Frank Miranda, the rotund, silver-haired director of the Institute of Languages and Linguistics. Having edited sections of both his tapes onto separate reels, Kara started the tape recorder, and the two men listened with headphones to the fevered voice croaking gibberish. When it ended, Kara slipped the headphones onto his shoulders and asked, "Frank, what is that? Could it possibly be a language?" His earphones off as well, Miranda was sitting on the edge of his desk, his arms folded as he stared at the floor and frowned in puzzlement. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "Pretty weird." He glanced up at Kara's. "Where'd you get that?" "I'm working on a case of dual personality." "You're kidding me. A priest?" "I can't say." "Yes, of course. I understand." "Well, what about it, Frank? You'll do it?" Staring off thoughtfully, Miranda gently lifted off his tortoiseshell reading glasses, absently folding and then slipping them into the slim lapel pocket of his seersucker jacket. "No, it isn't any language that I've ever heard of," he said. However, slightly frowning, he glanced up at Kara's. "Want to play it again?" Kara's rewound the tape, replayed it, turned off the recorder and said, "Any ideas?" "Well, I must say, it does have the cadence of speech." A sudden quickening of hope arose in the Jesuit, brightening his eyes for an instant, and then dimming as he reflexively fought down the hope. "But I don't recognize it. Father, the director continued. Is it ancient or modern? He asked. I don't know. Well, why not leave it with me, Father? I'll check it much more thoroughly with some of the boys. Maybe one of them will know what it is. Could you please make a copy of it, Frank? I'd like to keep the original myself. Oh, well, sure. In the meantime, I've got another tape. Got the time? Yes, of course. A tape of what? Let me ask you something first. Sure, what is it? Frank, what if I were to give you samples of ordinary speech by what are apparently two different people? Could you tell by semantic analysis whether just one person might have been capable of both modes of speech? Oh, I think so. Yeah. Oh, well, sure. A type token ratio, I suppose, would be as good a way as any to work that out, and with samples of 1,000 words or more, you could just check the frequency of occurrence of the various parts of speech. And would you call that conclusive? Pretty much. You see, that sort of test would discount any change in the basic vocabulary. It's not the words but the expression of the words, the style. We call it index of diversity. Very baffling to the layman, which, of course, is what we want. The director smiled wryly. Then he nodded at the tape in Karras's hands. And so this other person's voice is on that one? Not exactly. Not exactly. The voices and the words on both tapes came out of the mouth of one and the same person. The director's eyebrows rose. The same person? Yes. As I said, it was a case of dual personality. Could you compare them against one another for me, Frank? I mean, the voices sound totally different, but I'd still like to see what a comparative analysis would show. The director looked intrigued, even pleased. He said, fascinating. Yes. Yes, we'll run the analysis. I'm thinking maybe now I'll give it to Paul, he's my top instructor. Brilliant mind. I think he dreams in Indian code talk. Another favor. It's a big one. What? I'd prefer it if you did the comparison yourself. Oh. Yes. And as quickly as possible. Please? The director read the urgency in Karras's voice and in his eyes. Okay, he said, nodding. I'll get on it. Returning to his room in the Jesuit residence hall, Karras found a message slip under his door. Regan's records from Barringer Clinic had arrived. Karras hurried to reception, signed for the package, then returned to his room, sat down at his desk and started avidly reading, but at the end, as he read the conclusion of the clinic's psychiatric team, his mood of hopeful anticipation had slipped into one of disappointment and defeat, indications of guilt obsession with ensuing hysterical somnambulistic. Needing to read no more, Karras stopped, propped his elbows on the desk and, with a sigh, slowly lowered his face into his hands. Don't give up. Room for doubt. Interpretation. But in the matter of Regan's skin stigmata, which, according to the records, had recurred again repeatedly while Regan had been under observation at Barringer, the clinic's summary analysis had noted that Regan had hyperreactive skin and could herself have produced the mysterious letters by tracing them on her flesh with a finger a short time prior to their appearance, by a process known as dermatographia, a theory buttressed by the fact that as soon as Regan's hands had been immobilized by restraining straps, the mysterious phenomena ceased. Karras lifted his head and eyed the telephone. Frank. Was there really any point now in running a comparison of the voices on the tapes? Call him off? Yes, I should, the priest concluded. He picked up the receiver. Dialed. No answer. He left word for the institute director to call, and then, exhausted, he stood up and walked slowly to his bathroom, where he splashed cold water onto his face. The exorcist will simply be careful that none of the patient's manifestations are left unexplained. Karras worriedly looked up at himself in the mirror. Had he missed something? What? The sauerkraut odor? He turned and slipped a towel off the rack and wiped his face. No. Autosuggestion would explain that, he recalled, as well as reports that, in certain instances, the mentally ill seemed able to unconsciously direct their bodies to emit a variety of odors.